Hello and welcome everybody to 52 Weeks of Leadership. My name is Molly Anderson and I serve as the Executive Director of UB Center for Leadership and Organizational Effectiveness. We're glad to have you here, and I want to make sure that I welcome everybody who is coming from around the world to join us each week, and a happy International Women's Day to all of you, to all women and to all who support women and gender equity. We're so thrilled today to have our Dean of School of Management, Paul Teslik. And for those of you who don't know Paul, he has been with the University of Buffalo for about 10 years. He's had an extensive career in scholarship and academic leadership. He's led the school's expansion of school initiatives, including diversity, equity, and inclusion, healthcare, entrepreneurship, social innovation, and global programs. He is a national expert in leadership development, team effectiveness, and organizational change. And he's known to be a prolific scholar in the field of leadership, published in the most selective management journals. He's here to talk with us today about learning from setbacks and how to develop a growth mindset. So I'd like to turn it over to Paul Teslik. Please give him a virtual warm welcome.
Thank you, Molly, and welcome everyone. Very glad to be able to be here. I'm going to start off by sharing my slides. So I do have some that will be going along with what I'll be speaking about. Hopefully everyone can see those. So to talk a little bit about kind of learning from setbacks, I guess kind of a place to start might be some notable examples of people certainly that we're all familiar with. You know, when we look, whether it's Steve Jobs to Henry Ford, to Walt Disney to J.K. Rowling, from Bill Gates to Arianna Huffington and Oprah, if you consider the most successful people in the world, the one common denominator is that they've all experienced setbacks, even failures, and that they've used those setbacks as ways to be able to learn, grow, develop, and in many cases, even reinvent themselves. Now, a great example of this is Oprah Winfrey, who many people are familiar, actually started off her media career in broadcast journalism. And she thought that that would be a great path to be able to pursue because she loved being able to talk to people, learn about their stories, and share that with others. But what she found was that in that role of a broadcast journalist, that it was, of course, fact-based and being focused around kind of delivering specific content, that it didn't allow her to be her authentic self. It didn't allow her to be able to express her empathy with the individuals involved in the stories that she was covering. And that came through in her work. In fact, it came through to the point where she actually got fired from that first broadcast journalism job that she held. And instead, though, of Oprah kind of taking that from the standpoint of doubling down and kind of continuing to persevere along that path, she took the opportunity that she was presented, which was to be assigned to this really kind of a bit of kind of an off hours program that was on this low rating spot and called Talking with People. And she used it as an opportunity to really connect with what her real interest was, which was being able to connect to human interest stories, being able to express her empathy, and to be able to do that in a way that connected with others. And the rest, as they say, is actually history. But it's a great example of adapting from a setback, a failure experience, and reinventing oneself. And so I'm an organizational psychologist, and I've spent a good part of my career trying to understand what it is and how it is that executives and professionals develop leadership competencies. The Center for Creative Leadership, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the work that they do, has done a great amount of work over the years to understand the keys to leadership development. And they've essentially identified three kind of broad categories. First, there are challenges. Along with that are support. And then finally, feedback as the three key ingredients to creating rich forms of leadership development. So challenge, of course, can come in many different forms, but you might think about it, for instance, as a stretch assignment, where someone is responsible for an expanded scope and set of responsibilities. So maybe, for instance, now they have strategic responsibilities, they have negotiating responsibilities, whereas they didn't have that in their job role before. That's requiring them to stretch, to challenge, to grow and develop those types of competencies from a leadership perspective that they didn't have. Now layer on top of that, being assigned, being given a mentor, having support from your manager as you're going through that stretch assignment to build and develop those skills, maybe with training and other forms of support. Maybe you even have an executive coach. And then you layer on top of that also developmental feedback. So you understand going into that stretch assignment, what are your strengths and what are your development opportunities? That's the recipe for leadership development. My colleagues and I had done kind of a series of studies kind of looking at these different pieces. And at the same time, while we found that all three of those were important, at the same time, we were also finding that there was something that was missing in this. And I'm interested in what you might see that is missing here. Beyond challenge, support, and feedback, thinking about this particularly when it comes to learning from setbacks, is there anything there that kind of strikes you as missing? And maybe you can drop that into the chat if any kind of ideas are coming along to you. And while you're doing that, and I'll be kind of looking at the chat here, think of, well, let me kind of just share an example of kind of what we were doing in our research. As we were kind of doing this, and we were working with a kind of a sample of early career professionals, what we were finding is as we were relating the extent to which their jobs were giving them challenge, they were experiencing support and feedback, we were finding a positive relationship between that and the degree of learning that they were experiencing in terms of leadership development. But that wasn't the whole story. We were still missing something. And as I'm kind of looking at some of the things that are coming across, many of you are hitting on exactly this. It is something about the characteristic of the person themselves that differentiates and influences how much that they're learning from that challenge experience, how much they lean into the support, how much they absorb the feedback that they're given, and be able to optimize that leadership development opportunity. And we found that particularly strong in the case when people were reporting the setbacks and failures that they were experiencing. And what was really kind of important, and it kind of goes to what I have here as kind of this next slide, is this notion of growth mindset. And many of you are probably familiar with this concept, which originated really with the work of Carol Dweck, who's a developmental psychologist at Stanford. And she started studying this concept actually looking at school-age kids. And what she found was, for example, if you gave kids some really tough math problems, what she noticed was different patterns of how kids approached those different challenging math problems, and observed that there were really a continuum of different responses. On one end of the continuum, you would see kids who kind of approach those problems with the mindset, the approach of trying to be able to impress the teacher by showing their intelligence to them. And so if they had the answer, they would be able to jump right up and be able to kind of share that enthusiastically, because that was their opportunity to be able to look smart to the teacher and in front of their friends. But when they were struggling with those math problems, what they noticed was they would often start to become defensive, they would become discouraged, they'd start to become very negative. They'd start saying things like, I'm just no good at math. So that was kind of one response, which, as you can kind of see here from kind of this description of the growth mindset versus the fixed mindset, that really kind of fits the definition of the fixed mindset. The growth in another set of responses, though, she noticed, were kids who weren't so interested in being able to impress the teacher with what they knew and how they could be able to solve the math problems. They were more interested in the process itself of trying to be able to show to themselves that they could be able to learn something new. And they did that through kind of persistence, by asking questions, by admitting when they were stuck. It was a very different type of response. And it demonstrated a level of resilience, this learning orientation. And what she noticed was that those were the students that ended up learning the difficult math content more easily, more successfully. They were more resilient. They were less likely to be able to give up. And she termed that this growth mindset, which really reflects the kind of mind as a muscle type of mentality. And this concept of growth mindset versus fixed mindset, we actually kind of see in the workplace as well. And I'm sure you've seen this as you've kind of encountered different experiences where some people kind of persist in the face of setbacks. They look at them as opportunities to be able to challenge themselves and to be able to be able to grow and evolve, versus those who might give up, get discouraged, and retreat in the face of adversity. So this notion of growth mindset seems to be really critical when it comes to learning from setbacks and dealing with failures. What I'd like to do next is actually show a video of an early career executive who's experienced a setback, and she'll talk about it. And I've chosen this particular example because I think it shows particularly well these different aspects of the growth mindset. And it's certainly easy to say, and perhaps obvious, that when we receive unsolicited criticism that is a setback for us, we need to listen and be open to that feedback, and not become defensive, right? I mean, that's kind of intuitive, but it's much harder to actually put that into practice. And so I think an actual kind of example of someone who's experienced that type of a setback and describes how they responded to it, again, with kind of the notion of this growth mindset, might be helpful. Just as a kind of a preview, this comes from Stanford's has this great series called Leadership Insight, and I'll drop the link to their series in the chat a little later so that you can be able to take a look at other examples if you want to. And this was actually something that inspired us within the School of Management to do on our own. We actually created a series of learning from leadership figures by going to some of our highly accomplished alumni and asking them about leadership lessons, and created our own series. And I'll put that in the chat a little bit later as well. So just so I optimize the video, I'm going to stop the share there. I'm going to cue the video, and I'm going to go back into screen share and run the video for us.
My name is Lisa Daw. I'm a Division Vice President at DaVita. DaVita is a kidney care company that takes care of people whose kidneys have failed and need dialysis. I've been at DaVita for 4 years, and I've been in the Division Vice President role for 1 year. So about a year into my role as a Regional Operations Director, I was invited to a meeting with senior executives, and there was a group of high potential junior executives, including me, invited to this meeting. We were invited to dinner. We thought this was just a social gathering, and were suddenly assigned to one of two groups that evening who needed to then tackle a business problem and present it to the senior executives the next day. That, of course, created a lot of stress. All of us wanted to put our best foot forward, and we were very invested in the outcome. So the next day, when we presented our findings and our recommendations, I was pretty surprised to hear one of the senior executives say, to hammer our conclusions and really question the logic of the presentation. I spoke up and answered his question on behalf of our group and explain the logic and how we'd gotten to a conclusion. And the presentation ended, and didn't think much about it after that. So later that night after the presentation, at a reception, another senior executive came up to me and she gave me some feedback, some unsolicited feedback that totally surprised me and frankly blindsided me. Her feedback to me was that I had basically pushed my point too strongly, pushed our team's point too strongly, and defended our position really inappropriately. And what I should have done is listened more carefully to the feedback and just taken it as for what it was and ended there. Initially, it was just a sort of surprised, embarrassed, angry. I can't, that's not what I intended. How could they receive it that way? And also, the embarrassment came from sort of a feeling of, I think I might have failed some big test in front of all these executives who'd invited us there for this purpose. And then anger of kind of, I thought this was an intellectual debate, and where was it a bad thing to sort of engage in a question and answer kind of dialogue. Another reaction that I had, though, was, wow, this is a different league. I'm on a director level. I think I'm doing okay. And I'm talking to people who are managing billion-dollar businesses, and what it's just a different league. And I think that's what hit me. And it did question sort of, do I want to play on that level? How do I feel playing on that level? Am I effective? Or, is my style just not consistent with that? For the first 24 hours after I got this feedback, I sort of kept to myself. I was very introspective, as I usually am when I'm trying to process these things. I just was working through it in my mind and trying to figure out, what did I miss? How was that blind spot such a big glaring blind spot for me? And I didn't really talk to anybody about it. I played the situation over in my head repeatedly, and luckily I had the quiet of my hotel room to kind of do that in between meetings and things like that. But it was really something I was processing. It was all I could think about. After about 24 hours, I was at a place where I felt like I had a choice. I could accept that feedback was probably true. There's definitely kernels of it. If she was not the only one who felt it, there are kernels that were true, and I really needed to try and improve the next time. So that was sort of one thing, just accept it, move on, improve. The other choice, or the other thing I thought I could do, was maybe to try and get even more feedback, open myself up to even more scrutiny, but get feedback from the rest of the people in the room and just say, what else did I miss here? I started with someone I knew well, with whom I was comfortable, so that if it was just a really hard conversation and more hard feedback, at least I was hearing it from someone I trusted and who sort of knew me beyond that one presentation. As I thought about what I was going to say to the executives when I was getting feedback, I thought it was best to just start by acknowledging what I thought I'd done wrong, and to just lay it out there and sort of say, here's the dirty laundry. I think that where I messed up, so that it wasn't something he had to revisit with me and remind me about. It was just more about, okay, how do I move forward and grow from this and increase capability around so that none of us have to go through this again. I did it one-on-one, informally, literally in the hallways of this meeting. We were all still in the same meeting together, and I knew I wouldn't have FaceTime opportunities with them otherwise, and so I just caught them, for 2-3 minutes at a clip to have this conversation. They were very open to it, and in some cases said, that's just, there are bumps in the road, and don't worry about it, and here's one thing you might want to think about for the next time. What I ended up with was a whole set of layers of feedback that I never would have gotten had I sort of shut down and said, I'm just going to move on from this. Instead, I really enriched my toolkit, leadership toolkit, and sort of found that my executive presence over time, over the next year, really improved because of that specific feedback I got in that 24-hour period. What also happened at that point was that the executives around me who were still watching, and we were all still on stage, these high potential junior executives, I think it really helped them understand that I was not only capable of learning and I was open to it, but that over time, over the next year, for example, that I was really ready for more because I had opened myself up in a way that's necessary for higher level leadership to feedback and to learning. Less than a year later, I was promoted. Before I thought I would be put in this role, I was promoted to vice president. And at that dinner, the same senior executive who had hammered our team on our conclusions came up to me and said he and others were impressed at at the speed and scope of my improvement in the period since then, and that had been a factor in my early promotion. One of the biggest lessons I took from this experience was it doesn't matter that you failed or how you failed, it's really how you fix the failure. It is so important, especially for me, to process what I've heard, this feedback that you get that's really tough, it hits you in your gut, versus sort of doing what you want to do, which is sort of react on the gut level and lash out and get angry. When I let it cycle through, I really came out of it on a different side, on a more thoughtful, mature side that really kind of took the emotion out of it and put me back in the driver's seat, gave me full accountability for my prior actions and empowered me to say, okay, well, what are you going to do better next time?
Great. So I hope the video was able to come through loud and clear for everyone and you could be able to hear that. So I'm interested in what it was that you observed, again, with this notion of kind of the growth mindset, kind of front and center. So if you have kind of thoughts about things that you saw Lisa do that were consistent with that notion of a growth mindset, would you mind just kind of putting them into the chat? And while you maybe kind of some examples of some of that coming up, what I'm going to do is to just go back to the screen share, if you don't mind. Oops. So I see she showed humility. She was reflective, embraced it as an opportunity, reflected on the feedback, resilient. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, she did all of those things. And so maybe just to kind of elaborate on some of those points that the things that you observed, I think one key piece here is that she took the time to be able to reflect on this feedback. She talked about how she used kind of the time in her hotel room alone to be able to process this rather than be able to kind of react immediately, which is, of course, kind of our immediate response when we received unsolicited kind of blindsiding criticism, is that we immediately go into that kind of defense zone, right? And what she did was try to work really hard to be able to resist that. And that can't happen unless you provide a little bit of kind of space to be able to do that and reflect and process on the feedback. Something else that you're kind of bringing up in some of the comments in the chat was that she was just very thoughtful and very deliberative about both how she processed the feedback, but also thinking about how she could be able to best learn from the feedback by opening herself up to even more scrutiny, is how she phrased it, by going out and getting even more feedback. And she was thoughtful about how she could be able to make it easy for others to be able to provide additional feedback and to be able to do it in a supportive way. Going back to that part about support and feedback, her growth mindset was helping to be able to add even more feedback and to be able to make sure that it was easy for people to be able to deliver it in a way that was constructive and also supportive. So that point about seeking out and gaining more feedback. And ultimately also, as you're talking about, she was willing to be able to learn from that criticism. And that's another hallmark of the growth mindset, is there's a willingness to be able to learn and develop from the criticism, because the criticism isn't about you as a person, it's about what you did. And there's something there to be able to learn from, to be able to improve on in the future. And then she also showed this kind of self-awareness of how she needed to be able to grow, which is something also that kind of fits in with that notion of the growth mindset. So those things that we talked about, the difference between kind of the fixed mindset and the growth mindset, hopefully this is kind of a helpful example to help kind of ground that in terms of how to actually kind of implement that growth mindset type of orientation in ways that help us be able to gain the kind of additional support that we need to be able to work through challenges and setbacks, and to be able to do that in a way that also enriches the amount of feedback that we're able to uptake and to be able to learn from. And then finally, this last point, I think, is something here I'm also maybe seeing in some of the comments too, is this notion of a double loop learning. And for those of you who work particularly in the area of organizational change, you'll be familiar with the work of Chris Argyris, who is the kind of legendary organizational change scholar who developed this concept of double loop learning and contrasting it with single loop learning. Single loop learning, of course, is kind of when we're learning from the relationship, but what we try and what we actually accomplish. So we're constantly able to tweak our techniques and our strategies by what we learn from results. Double loop learning is that next layer of learning that takes us back to the fundamental assumptions that are about kind of about values, those basic assumptions, about the beliefs behind what we do. And I'd go back to the example from Oprah again. What Oprah took from that setback she experienced was she applied that double loop learning. She questioned the fundamental assumptions about the kind of type of job that she wanted to pursue, what it was important to her that allowed her to be able to be authentic in her work, be able to do that human interest work. And then she redirected her career in pursuing that path. That couldn't have happened if she hadn't engaged in her own form of double loop learning. And I think we saw that also with Christine Daw, where she allowed herself to be able to step up on the balcony, so to speak, and to be able to observe what was going on through that feedback and be able to process that feedback and to be able to really put in place through that growth mindset set of tactics, a way to be able to take that setback experience and to be able to learn from it in a really rich and powerful way. So what I'm going to do here is just kind of wrap things up, and I'd like to close with a few quotes. And this one by Barack Obama is probably one of my favorites, that you can't let your failures define you. You have to let your failures teach you. And I think that really kind of embodies this notion of the growth mindset that we were talking about. Elaborating on that a little bit, being challenged in life is, of course, inevitable. Being defeated is optional. Again, that's kind of a hallmark of that growth mindset. Life is 10% what happens to you and 90% of how you react to it. So in leadership coaching, sometimes we use the term second act, and that it kind of gets captured in this quote. Act number one is what happened. Act number two is the more important act, and it's how you respond to what ended up happening, in this case, a setback, and how you grow and learn from it. And then finally, when things do not go your way, remember that every challenge, every adversity contains within it seeds of opportunity and growth. Again, I think that kind of illustrates this growth mindset mentality. So I just want to say thank you. I'm opening things up here to some questions. If you have something that you'd like to include into the chat, observations or other things to be able to share, please do so. You know, we keep these to a half hour, but I'm happy also to stay around for a little bit if there are questions or observations or things that people want to be able to share in the chat.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for support of the series too. I mean, what a great way to demonstrate the growth mindset that you've allowed in the School of Management, for allowing us to be able to just try so many new things this past year, to embrace the challenges of COVID. We have some questions if you have a moment to answer them. One is from Arlene Caucus. She said setbacks are to be expected, and the dialogue raises the importance of the receiver of the feedback to respond appropriately, but also the responsibility of the communicator of the feedback to deliver the message in a way to ensure this opportunity for growth. What is the responsibility of the communicator to deliver the message in a way that facilitates growth?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you could kind of see that in that example that I shared, was that she had the benefit of having supportive executives who they know they delivered some tough, unexpected feedback, but what they were impressed by was the fact that she was willing to be able to learn from that feedback, and so providing that type of support. So a great observation, Arlene, is that kind of development it takes the village, so to speak, and part of that responsibility is from the person who's delivering that feedback to do it in a way that's supportive, to deliver it in a way that helps people gain some insight that they didn't have already. And so there certainly are techniques for being able to provide that feedback in a supportive way by stating your kind of intentions up front, that the feedback is there for their own growth and development. It might be kind of hard to hear, but it's an important message, and that you're there also to be able to continue having a dialogue and a discussion. And certainly those are some kind of immediate thoughts, but absolutely a great point made by Arlene on that question.
We also have a question from Maureen. What does the research suggest about how difficult it is to transform from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset?
Yeah, so a great question. And you know, there are kind of dissertations on that topic about kind of growth mindset. One of the things that we know, and a lot of this goes back to Dweck's work looking at in kind of educational settings in the classroom environment, is that it's largely learned, and that teachers have a huge impact on how students develop and acquire a growth mindset. And a lot of that has actually been kind of channeled into education programs for teachers in training and helping them cultivate and instill a growth mindset. But it comes in place in the workplace as well. Certainly one of the things that we know when it comes to leadership development, probably the most kind of critical piece in that is the role that your manager plays. And are they supportive of your development? Do they show a genuine interest in your career trajectory and your growth? Do they help you think about how you can take advantage of natural learning opportunities, whether it be kind of an extension on a new assignment, or whether it be through formal training and development? Are they there to help you kind of debrief experiences that might be setbacks? All of those are things that are absolutely important. And when it comes to reports of great managers, what we continuously hear is the support for others' growth and development as one of the top characteristics of really successful managers who attract talent to them, because they develop a reputation for being there to be able to support in the growth and development of the people on their teams.
Thanks, Paul. And any final thoughts on resources on how to help others develop a growth mindset?
Well, I often recommend Dweck's book. She also has a really good TED Talk, which is a kind of a good place to start. But a lot of that growth mindset pieces of the book that she has are very applicable into kind of the workplace setting. And I think it's the kind of the strategies fall into two categories: things that you can do yourself to be able to develop that growth mindset, like we saw with that example that I shared in the video, but also from the standpoint of how you can provide and reinforce that growth mindset as a peer, as a mentor, as a manager to others. So that would certainly be one place that I would direct people to, would be going to Dweck's great book.
We have one more question from Dr. Nancy Askins, asking if there's any research showing the growth mindset and behavioral deployment of core values.
Oh, that's an interesting question. So I don't know if I've seen it from the standpoint of core values per se, but we do know that kind of a growth mindset is related to other aspects like self-confidence, self-efficacy. So what we find is that it requires a certain amount of trust in yourself. Well, actually quite a lot of trust in yourself and self-confidence. And so kind of helping people feel confident of moving into a new challenge opportunity certainly kind of helps reinforce engaging in a growth mindset. But that's an interesting question, and maybe there's a study in that that is underlying that question there.
Well, thanks again, Paul, and thank you everyone for joining us. Next week, we have Dr. Aisha Mali on Leading with Empathy, and please watch your inbox for some exciting news about this year's Chloe conference, as well as this continuation of the series. Thanks, everyone. Have a great week and see you next time.
Thank you. Take care.